Good morning, everyone. Thank you, distinguished speakers on the dais and very experienced members of the union and bankers in the audience. I'm sorry that I have jumped the queue a little bit. This is not the order in which it was envisaged, but I have a little minor one, but I have to be present somewhere else, as was mentioned. So I requested that I be allowed to speak earlier, and I'm very thankful to Lalithaji for having allowed me to speak conversations with the banking unions by saluting them for fighting a heroic battle over the last 3 decades in keeping the public sector banking in India safe and secure. And it's very important that economists like me, who basically think that their job is writing papers or writing here and there and so on, recognize the importance of fighting on the ground, which people like you do to keep our society and economy safe. So please accept my salutes to you on this heroic path that you have chosen together. It's also very timely that we have among us Mr. Hemendra Hazari. I don't know whether he will enjoy this characterization of his, but there's a glorious legacy hiding behind him. His father is R.K. Hazari, who worked on the monopolies report of 1960s, which in many ways was also instrumental in bank nationalization in 1969. So it's also very timely that we've invited him to speak on this, and he carries the flag very high. If you read his websites, blogs, and articles very carefully, so I'm very unfortunate that I'm likely to miss what he's likely to say. So here we are. We are today speaking about public sector banks and in India and the way forward. Now, the first point to note is that we live in an era where you have a certain fusion of 2 ideologies, and that is what is the ideology of the ruling class in India today. The first ideology is that of neoliberalism. This idea of neoliberalism, which has prevailed for over 3 decades now in the Indian economy, from around the early 90s onwards, is primarily an ideology. There is very little theory that backs it. In fact, whatever theory backs the ideology of neoliberalism is faulty theory. For example, the theories of financial repression, as they call it, where it is argued that any ceiling on interest rates, either for deposits or for credit, is actually likely to depress savings and investment rates in the economy, has been long proven to be very wrong by India's nationalization itself. India's nationalization and public sector banking from 60s to 90s was marked by many ceilings of interest rates, but we had a very regular rise of savings rate and interest rates and so on. So to argue that ceilings on interest rates will actually lead to a fall of savings rate or a fall of investment rate is complete nonsense. That theory is completely bogus. Yet, neoliberalism or the ideology that embraces it consider these kinds of theories as sacred and think of interest rate deregulation as a very important part of financial liberalization in India. So to begin with, neoliberalism is an ideology that is based on either no theory, it is a political ideology, or if at all there is a theory, it is faulty theory. That's on the one side. On the other hand, you have the ideology of the Hindutva, which is fused with this neoliberal ideology, and it is also the ideology of the ruling class today for over a decade. And it is very important at this point to note that when the nationalization of banks happened in 1969, there were 2 people who went to the Supreme Court questioning the constitutional validity of bank nationalization. One was not surprising. His name was Minu Masani, the leader of the Swatantra Party in India, which was a right-wing party from the time of independence itself, so it was not surprising. But what was surprising was the person who joined him in that application. His name was Balraj Madhok. Balraj Madhok was a very senior leader of the RSS, a political mentor of Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who passed away about a decade back, and he was a very towering leader of the of the right-wing Hindutva nationalism that we speak about today. So the point to note here is that the genesis of that time and Bharatiya Janata Party of today are fundamentally opposed to the ideology of nationalization of banks. And they are the party, or they are the ruling alliance which is handling policy in India. So this ideology of neoliberalism, which is based on faulty theory, which adopts privatization and all very openly on the one hand, and on the other hand the idea of Hindutva nationalism, which divides people communally and so on the one side, but also has a very perverse economic ideology to back it up, is what is the ideology of the ruling class today. So it is not an easy time for public sector banks, to be very clear. The crisis that public sector banking is facing today, despite the profits and all it is supposed to be making, it will come to that, is actually very imminent. The crisis is very imminent, and the crisis stems from the fact that the ruling regime of today has a certain ideological characterization behind it. So that's the first point that I wanted to make. But more generally, if you look at what neoliberalism or the ideology that drives financial liberalization actually argue, they argue 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 major points, which they think are theoretically sound points from their point of view. First, they will argue that private sector banks are more efficient than public sector banks. This they will argue because private sector banks have lower operating costs, they focus on profits, they focus on efficiency and so on, and so the overall efficiency of the banking sector will be higher when private sector banks are in place. Second point they will argue is that when you have private sector banks which are efficient like this, they are also financially viable on their own. And because they are financially viable on their own, they do not require to depend on the state or the government for frequent episodes of recapitalization or bailing out and so on. That's the second argument that they usually make. The third argument that they usually make is that because they don't need recapitalization like this, and because they're viable on their own, the state is able to, or the government is able to divert the money that they would otherwise have spent on recapitalization to, say, education, health, infrastructure investment, etc. So it reduces the fiscal burden on the state. That is a third argument that is usually made. The fourth argument that is usually made is that because private sector banks are governed by the discipline of the market, they also have very high standards of corporate governance. And this is actually good for the banking sector. So shareholders and creditors will hold the private banks accountable, and hence they will have very high standards of corporate governance. The fifth and final argument, there are many, but I'll just summarize them to just 5. Argument is that they promote a lot of innovation, technology, and so on, and public sector banks are laggards in innovation, technology, and so on, and hence private sector banks are inherently good. So these are 4 or 5 important points that you keep hearing when you hear about the comparisons between public sector banks and private sector banks. But allow me to say that all of them are completely based on the absence of any evidence. In fact, the evidence is quite to the contrary. Let's take each one of these 5 points and examine their validity. First, are public banks less efficient than private banks? Well, it depends on how you define efficiency. If you define efficiency as purely operating profit, as purely balance sheet matter, then maybe you're right, because they try to cut costs everywhere, they try to employ less people at lesser salaries with less contractual stability, less social security, and so on. Most of the private banks, for example, shy away from having any social responsibility. Now, if that is okay with you, then that argument is right. So in other words, the efficiency of private banks that we are talking about comes with enormous amounts of social opportunity costs, as economists would call it. In other words, if you simply look at Axis Bank, HDFC Bank, or that kind of private sector banks in India, they largely finance or cater to what are called as the high margin urban clientele of banks. Whereas public banks are left with what are called high cost but low revenue segments of the borrowing class. If you look at India, 88% of the rural bank branches are public sector banks. If you look at crop loans are given to farmers in India, 75% of the crop loans in India are given by public sector banks at 4% interest, a very low interest of 4%. They get a subvention, of course, but it's still 7%, not more than that. Then if you look at 2007-8, the financial crisis of 2007-8 and so on, you will see that the public sector banks managed to absorb most of the liquidity shocks when private sector banks simply froze their operations in many ways. Private sector banks froze many of their operations. Public sector banks continued to absorb the liquidity shocks and function in the economy. Then when the Prime Minister's Jan Dhan Yojana happened, about 80% of the close to 46 crore accounts that were opened were by public sector banks. It came with enormous transaction costs, administrative costs and so on, but they bore it. Then came the stupidest policy of India after independence, the demonetization. When demonetization happened in 2016, public sector banks were the banks which managed close to 90 to 95% of the cash exchanges that were taking place. When did you go home? 2 a.m., 3 a.m. and came back at what? 8 a.m., 9 a.m. That's the kind of work that you did for over 2 or 3 months during that period. What did they pay you back with? Almost nothing. Right? Not even a thank you. Right? So this is also part of the story. Then come COVID. Much of the moratoriums were shouldered by public sector banks. Much of the emergency credit relief that went to MSMEs went from public sector banks. What did private sector banks do? Nothing. So if you actually consider all these low revenue or low margin but socially valuable activities of public sector banks, of course profits will be lower. And if you call that as poor efficiency, I'm sorry, that the problem is with your definition of efficiency, not with the working of the public sector banks. So that argument has to be comprehensively rejected. That there is an efficiency problem in public sector banks. Are they going to say that before liberalization or before financial liberalization, public sector banks were recording losses? No, they were recording profits then also. So there is no argument that private sector public sector banks were loss-making in any form. One or two may have been, but overall banking sector and the public sector was profitable. Right? So that's the first point to say. But the whole point of efficiency, as in the economic literature, if you read Joseph Stiglitz and others, they will argue that there is no concept of efficiency at all in the financial sector. They will argue that the financial markets are the most notoriously imperfect markets in the world, and anybody talking about efficiency in the financial market is probably living in a fool's paradise. Right? So that's comprehensively to be rejected. Second argument that we considered was that private sector banks, because they are functioning efficiently, are viable on their own and hence do not require recapitalization and so on. This is also completely wrong in multiple ways. Because private sector banks have profits as their dominant ideology in many ways, even when they make profit, they are actually hungry for even more profits. Right? And this constant sprinting behind profits all the time constantly pushes them towards highly risky activities, which is very well known. So they are highly risk-taking in many ways. For example, the examples of yes banks risky loans are in front of us. A very classic example is out there. This hunger for profits always also leads to speculative bubbles in the economy and in credit portfolios, and this makes banking crisis inevitable in multiple ways. So there is a hunger for profits in order to remain viable, but the very same hunger for profits pushes the banks and the banking sector as a whole into new and new crises in frequent intervals. This is what we call in economics as the moral hazard. The moral hazard essentially means that you know that if you fail, the government will bail you out. So you are because you are sure that the government will bail you out, you are free to take whatever irrational risk that you want to take up. And that's what you see again and again. This happened in the case of Global Trust Bank, which when collapsed in 2004. This happened in the case of Yes Bank, 2020. This happened in the case of across the world. If you see Silicon Valley Bank, 2023, again this happened in the United States. So all these cases are there where the taxpayers came out and bailed them out with huge amounts of money in order to keep them viable. Right? So the idea that they are viable on their own is not something that stands up to evidence. The third point is that because there is less recapitalization, the state or the government saves a lot of money which it can invest elsewhere. This is also completely true because across the world you've seen governments every decade or every decade and a half keep absorbing the losses of private sector banks through bailing them out. That's where the well-known, I don't need to repeat that cliche here anymore, socializing of losses and privatization of profits. That happens primarily because governments have historically bailed out these banks at frequent intervals. In United States, you see it when the banking crisis happened in 2007. They even went out and close to nationalized a few banks in the United States. In UK, you saw with the Royal Bank of Scotland. In UK, you saw again with the Lloyds Bank. Then the Fannie Mae and the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the United States. What are all these banks? All these banks collapsed during that time, and the governments had to come out and rescue them with huge packages using taxpayers' money. Right? So this is not saving government money. This is actually a drain on government money that you see at frequent intervals. Why even Switzerland had to rescue the UBS with huge amount of infusion of public funds. It happened in Germany, it happened in Iceland, it happened in Ireland. Everywhere you saw. In many cases you saw 100% nationalization of the type India saw in 1969 in order to save these loss-making banks. The fourth point that they usually make is that because private sector banks are efficient like this, they have much better standards of corporate governance. Now, that's a bit of a joke, right? You see from case after case in India, where this whole process of commodification of finance has kept corruption at the core of that process. It is corrupt to the core in many ways. So there's no claim to corporate governance that you can actually have in this particular case, because in many cases shareholders and investors want short-term profit. They want to prioritize short-term profits over what we call as long-term stability. When that happens, what happens is that the classic ICICI Bank case will happen, where the NPAs were not noticed by the so-called board of theirs till 2016, and suddenly a lot of 40,000 crore or something of NPAs were realized. What happened to the board of the ICICI Bank when that nice deal between Videocon and ICICI Bank was being stitched up, right? 64 crore was being given to the managing director's husband's company, whereas a 1,600 crore loan or something was being negotiated between ICICI Bank and Videocon. There was corporate governance at that point of time. Whereas what is Rana Kapoor's corporate governance? What is Ramesh Jelly's corporate governance? Right? These questions have to be asked. So this whole point, whereas on the other hand, you don't see except occasional here and there allegations in the very large public sector, banking sector that you see, there are very few allegations of corruption. Most of the allegations of corruption stem in the private sector, banking sector. So that is also something which is very striking. Then, are they more innovative? Are they more technology adopting and so on? In some way, yes, they invest more in technologies and so on. But it's also important that these technologies or innovations that they are supposedly undertake benefit a small clientele of theirs, which is largely urban in character. Right? Very few of these innovations actually reach the rural farmers or rural non-agricultural occupations and so on. In fact, across the world, if you read the work of this economist from London, Mariana Mazzucato, an Italian economist who works in London, you will see that she speaks about how the governments across the world are the entities which have undertaken most of the investments in innovation. Most of the innovations from the time of internet, if you see downwards, you see most of the innovations are actually financed by the public sector and the government. In India, you will see the UPI, and for me it's a very, very important innovation by the NPCL, which is actually a non-profit entity, which has significantly changed our banking sector for good. The digitalization that we see is riding on the back of that important innovation in the public sector. And you don't see that kind of innovation, which has huge reach of that sort in the private sector, though they have some in which serve a particular clientele. So all these arguments that you have, that they are more efficient, that they are viable on their own, that they don't depend on the state, that they have corporate governance high standards, or they have they bring about innovation and technology in a big way. All of that are either completely wrong or stand on very weak grounds. So the conceptual argument for privatization, the conceptual argument for prioritizing private banks over public banks is very weak, or simply doesn't exist. Come to India, you look at the whole experience of financial liberalization and public banking and private banking in India after 1991. You will see that the most important shift, as you all know more than me, between the pre-1991 era and the post-1991 era is the abandoning of the social and development banking agenda of nationalization after the 1990s. Now, even if the social and development banking agenda has the remnants of it have persisted after 1991, for example, in the financial inclusion policy that we have after 2005, it is only earlier the social and development banking agenda ensured that the social objectives are served even if they fetch you a little less profit. Right? That was the definition given to social and development banking at one point of time. You don't bother if your profits fall from 50 to 40 if a social objective is served. But the key shift that you see in the financial inclusion policy that you see after 2005 is that you ensure that even while you meet a social objective, you must make a profit. That is why if you have a no-frills account, or if you have a so-called zero balance account, which is hardly zero balance, you see banks making about 21,000 crore profit in a year just by charging fines on people not keeping minimum balance in their banks. What kind of inclusion is that? What kind of, it's actually squeezing the people who already have zero balance. Right? So you are actually pushing the zero balance people to negative balance people. Right? Tomorrow the NRBS wage comes to their bank account and the guy goes to withdraw that money. They say, no, the money is not there because it has been absorbed into your previous loss, because you have a penalty outstanding because you did not keep balance in your bank account. Right? So you're pushing people from zero balance to actually negative balance, where before all this they were probably positive balance. Right? That is what is essentially happening. I'm just sort of pushing the case a little harsher, but probably that's the case in many instances that we know of. Look at, for example, the area of rural credit. That's a classic example of abandoning of a social or public sector banks. They start running behind commercial or profit-oriented objectives. I was looking at, for example, what it entails to be a priority sector agricultural loan today. Yeah, I worked on it a lot, but I was just went back to it and checked what it is today. So I saw the following. Agriculture includes not just individual farmers, but also corporate farmers. What is a corporate farmer? No, I know a farmer, but what is this distinction between an individual farmer? The priority sector guidelines say individual farmer and then a corporate farmer. Who is this corporate? So this basically is a company. This is not a farmer. It is actually a company. So, and then you have separately your joint stock companies, partnership firms, etc. listed as well. So they are also part of this, and the credit limit for each of these borrowing entities is rupees 4 crore. Rupees 4 crore is a credit limit for the corporate farmers, which can be included under the 40% priority sector target. Now, whatever is existing over and above your 18%, The regulations allow you to include it in the 40%. So if you have a shortfall in 40, your excess over 18 can be included there in order to meet that 40. So all this is useful to meet that 40 at the end of it. Then loans up to rupees 100 crore for agricultural infrastructure. Right? Then you have loan up to 50 crore for startups. Then you have loan up to 100 crore for food and agri processing. Then you have export credit to agricultural sector, and then you have on lending primarily by NBFCs who take a crop loan type loan from the banks and then lend it out to somebody else at 10 to 15%. This was not allowed earlier. Right? On lending was not allowed earlier. Now this on lending, which is actually making money at the expense of people, is actually now legal under financial liberalization. This is the situation that we have today. Now, they actually, in fact, if you are on lending for microcredit purposes, what you borrow at 8 or 9% can actually be on lended at about 36% up to 40, 45, 50% in some cases if the microcredit agency so thinks it fit. Right? So this is the other problem that we generally see. So this whole thing of weakening of rural credit is a big problem that we see. Then you have a serious regulatory asymmetry. Regulatory asymmetry in the sense what you insist from public sector banks, you don't insist from private sector banks. You don't insist from foreign banks. Till 2018, it will thankfully changed later, the priority sector target for foreign banks was 25%, while it was 40% for public sector banks. And this they did by completely doing away with all forms of rural branches and so on. Today, they have been asked to go to 40% priority sector lending, but you also have priority sector lending certificates. What you can't lend, you can actually sell. So if SBI is having more agricultural lending, the foreign bank can actually go to SBI and say, can I show some of your priority sector lending as mine? So, and you give me a certificate that is mine, and I can show that I have met my 40%, even though I may not have even one rural branch. Right? So, without a single rural branch, you may have hundreds of crores of agricultural loans in your book. Right? That's the magic that we have today. So, this regulatory asymmetry is there. Then, what pushed these public sector banks into this old NPA crisis from which you have moved out recently only? Right? It was policy. It was the policy of liberalization which essentially collapsed the difference between development finance in the long term and short-term lending by commercial banks, which was retail credit in the first place. This collapse of the distinction between retail credit and development finance in the long term was the starting of the problem. So you asked commercial banks whose deposits are short-term in nature, liabilities are short-term in nature, anybody can ask money anytime, right? And you ask them to lend in the long term, Kingfisher, Bhushan Steel, whatever, right? And on the other hand, you ask those who have long-term interest to also take short-term deposits on the other side. So you completely collapse the distinction between short-term lending and long-term lending, and this essentially, when SBI or other banks had to shoulder this long-term lending thing, they did not have the expertise to do so in the beginning. They did not have the means to sort of scrutinize which is a good project or which is not a good project. And of course, there was pressure from the government to lend more to infrastructure sector in the 2000s. All this came together, and then the NPA problem happened. The NPA problem was a creation of the government. When the NPA problem became acute, the government said, we can't do anything about it. We are thinking about privatizing you. Right? And this policy-led crisis, which is the NPA crisis, has been completely characterized as an inefficiency problem of public sector banks, which is completely untrue. Right? So this is a very key problem. This collapse of this whole mismatch between assets and liabilities, which this created in the bank's balance sheets, was a very important problem. Then finally, look at private sector banks and their record. I don't need to tell you what happened to the Global Trust Bank. I don't need to tell you what happened to the Yes Bank. I don't need to tell you what happened in the Global Trust Bank. their balance sheets were constantly showing 40 crore profit, if I'm forgetting the number, a profit of 40 or few hundred crores. But when the RBI went in and saw, in each of the years they were showing positive profits, they were actually having net negative losses. So it was actually manipulation of the books that was happening so openly. And when this Global Trust Bank had about 1,500 crore of NP, of which I think 200, 300 or 400 crore was given to Ketan Parekh at that point of time, the RBI asked the merger with Oriental Bank of Commerce. Right? And how much did Oriental Bank of Commerce pay? If I remember correctly, it was close to 1,500 crore rupees, which Oriental Bank of Commerce had to dish out in order to absorb the losses of Global Trust Bank. I think Sanjeev can correct me if I am wrong, which is close to something like that amount of money that they had to dish out. Similar thing happened with Yes Bank. When this whole problem was found out after 2017, and the NPAs rose up to about 20,000 crore or so by 2020. The SBI took over this whole loss. And how much was that loss? If I'm right again, it was close to 7,200 crore of money that the SBI had to dish out to absorb the losses of the Yes Bank. And the government also additionally, if I'm right, waived about another 8,000 crore rupees or so of 81 bonds of Yes Bank. That's also another loss. So this total loss, if you add of SBI and the government, it's a huge loss for the government for a mistake of this Kapoor guy who constantly violated laws. Right? Come to Lakshmi Vilas Bank, old bank, 1926 bank, here in which RSS was formed. Right? Sorry, that it gives you a wrong comparison, but then it collapsed. Right? And then this the Fortis or Malvinder Singh company, the brothers split later. I think that was the most important drain on Lakshmi Vilas Bank. Here again, when the DBS Bank was asked to take over the losses of it, I think the scheme of amalgamation of the RBI meant that close to 400 crore was written away by the RBI to ensure that this scheme of amalgamation actually comes into being. This whole collapse of the development finance on the one hand and the crisis of private sector retail banks on the other is the outcome that we have. Right? And I think I won't step on the feet of Sanjeev, who is an expert in long-term infrastructure finance. But across the world, if you see, development financial institutions are a reality. Look at every developed capitalist country in the world. You have one large development financial institution still going strong and financing very core infrastructure or innovation sectors. Right? This is the KfW in Germany. The KfW in Germany is instrumental in funding close to 60% of all their investments in solar energy in Germany. Just like Korean Development Bank in its time was the key investor in the semiconductor industry in Korea at that point of time. This is what is happening today with KfW in Germany. If you take other, the EU Invest or Invest EU as you call it, the European Union's one, it's about 75% of the project risks in all green technology investments are underwritten by InvestEU, which is another DFI there. Then, if you take Netherlands FMO, they fund enormous amounts of green projects. If you go to the Nordic and Baltic countries and look at the Nordic Investment Bank, 50% of the lending for climate and energy related investments are made by that DFI. Then, if you look to the British Business Bank, in the UK, you will see that close to 90% of the unicorns in the UK are financed by this British Business Bank. Then Italy's Cassa Depositi, which is a small bank there, they close to 70% of the lending to small firms in southern Italy is actually handled by this. So you have DFIs everywhere, and they are they are getting into areas which are new, green technology, climate financing, innovations, smart technologies, all these unicorns, startups, they are big players everywhere. And whatever ICICI, IDBI, IFCI, we have successfully dismantled them. In few years back, in a budget, it was said that we will form a new DFI, right? And we have not heard anything about that DFI after that. But I was thinking, why do you want a new DFI when you already have 3 or 4? You just have to revive them. You have to recapitalize them and you have to revive them. And you basically successfully killed all of that. The IDBI story is well known. Again, Sanjeev is the expert. It was a loss-making company. It became into losses. You recapitalized it. Then you asked LIC to come in, and now it is making profit, ready for sale. Right? You basically put money into it, taxpayers' money into it, make it profitable, and then gift it to the private sector. Emirates National Bank of Dubai is actually, I think, ready to buy that company now. So this, across the world, when development finance institutions are going on strongly and continue to be relevant, India doesn't have even one good DFI today, and whatever DFIs we have ended up dismantling them. So this is the broad context in which we are meeting today and discussing this topic of public sector banks in India and their way forward. The question in front of all of us is how to revive public banking in India. Now, revival of public banking in India, in my view, will require a very decisive walking away from the core ideologies of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is not an economic strategy, it is a political project. Neoliberalism is a political project of gifting away the wealth of one class of people in the society to another class of people in the society, create a speculative economy, create a dominance of finance over production, and thereby put profits on top of all productive national interests. And thus make the international or global finance capital a profit-making reality. Now that is the core ideology. Neoliberalism is not to be seen in a textbook because it is a political ideology. And whatever theory it borrows from neoclassical economics or other textbooks is faulty theory. Right? So this political nature of neoliberalism is an ideology, has to be appreciated by us, and this walking away from the precepts of financial liberalization is a necessary condition for the revival of public banking. And of course, there are other things that you know much better about how to improve. If that happens, then and if the social objectives are brought back, then you know how best to finance agriculture, you know how best to finance small industries, MSMEs, you know how best to finance the other toiling classes of the society, and also if you revive development financial institutions also, you can also try to meet the more important requirements of investments in, for example, adaptation in climate finance or green technology, etc., etc. So that agenda is something that we need to start discussing more seriously, very, very meticulously now, and of course, the people who will hold that flag high, who will come to the streets and ensure that the political classes understand the mood is you, the great warriors of the banking unions. I hope that you will continue to keep that flag high, and the memories of Comrade Tarakeswar Chakraborti will continue to inspire you to go on that path of this is the national interest. Those who are this is the right time to understand who is an anti-national and who is a nationalist. Right? When I see this hall in front of me, I can see only nationalists. Right? And whoever we are criticizing, they are the real anti-nationals out there. Right? And it is important for us to tell people who is anti-national and who is a national. Thank you.